Knight and Changeling, Chapter 13. Dinner. Jen shook her head as she weaved her motorcycle through traffic. The last 2 days had been crazy. An emergency signal had pulled them off Earth to the home planet of the arachnochimps, which had been practically overrun by DN aliens. With some help from Simeon, the con artist they'd met just before the hybrid invasion, and Eunice, the prototype Unitrix who now worked as Azimuth's assistant, they'd managed to sort it out quite quickly. Then, the day they'd gotten back, a large ship full of Technodrone robots had landed, each harder to beat than the other, and all set on killing her. Hired by Vulcanus, who, in the end, helped them defeat it, though he hadn't meant to. The fact that she was able to trick the advanced tech by covering the Ultimatrix with her jacket and using Kevin's old ID mask to make it look like Vulcanus had it instead really spoke to the shoddy design of the bots, which the three of them had laughed over. There was some good news to be had, though. Pierce was stable. He was still stuck in medical, as they were regrowing one of his kidneys and part of his lung from the damage he'd sustained at the hands of the Forever Knights. Driscoll and his men, who'd shown up tied and beaten not too long after the night himself, were being prosecuted to the full extent of 2 different sets of laws and were currently lounging in the cells at the Plumber base. Jen turned down a side street and pulled up to a small diner. She parked and pulled out her phone to check the address. She nodded to herself and pulled off her helmet, placing it in the saddlebag of her bike. She pulled a shoulder bag out of the other one and swung it over her shoulder as she dismounted. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the diner. It was late, nearing midnight. Her parents had given up on making her keep a curfew when they found out the truth. After all, evil didn't keep school night hours, though she wouldn't have to worry about that for a few months yet. Though it was a 24-hour restaurant, the diner was empty, save for an older woman behind the bar. She looked up at the tinkle of the bell and smiled as Jen slipped into a booth away from the windows. She stepped over to her and handed her a menu. "What can I get you, sweetie?" she asked, popping her gum. Jen glanced at the door. "I'm actually waiting for someone, so I think just a Coke for now." The waitress nodded and stepped back behind the counter to get her a drink. The bell over the door sounded again, and a man walked in. Jen grinned as she stood. He looked over at her, his bright blue eyes crinkled into a smile. "Jennifer, it's good to see you." She nodded as he stepped up to her. She pulled him into a hug. "It's good to see you too, George." They sat on opposite sides of the booth as the waitress came back with Jen's Coke and asked for George's order. He ordered a black coffee and the breakfast platter. Jen grinned and ordered a burger and fries. The waitress poured George his coffee and went back to the kitchen with their order. George smiled. "You haven't aged a day. In 1,700 years. Jen laughed. "Not quite that long for me. Only like a week. Time travel is weird." George nodded into his coffee. "Yes, I imagine so. It has been so long, I don't know where to start. The plumber that Driscoll attacked, will he live?" Jen nodded as she sipped her soda. "Yes, it'll take a while for him to recover, but he'll live." "When did your nights go so sour?" She hadn't meant it to sound like an accusation, but that was how it came out. George sighed. "I left the knights to their own devices for several centuries. When last I was involved with them, the Crusades had ended. Many of them found it glorious, but I could not stomach the violence anymore. I left an heir in charge and vanished into the wilds for a long time. I learned things. But by the time I again looked in on my legacy, it was poisonous and cancerous. I'm ashamed to say I did nothing to change it. I exiled myself for my failure. I only returned to England 70 or so years ago, hoping that I would again meet a friend. I had no idea you were here." Jen's smile was melancholy. "Well, I couldn't have been specific in my note back then. You wouldn't have believed me, or understood." George nodded and pulled something out of his pocket. He laid a stone on the table and nodded to it. "It led me to the seal." Jen nodded, picking up the stone. It was cracked in the same place the seal had been broken. "Another thing you can thank your knights for," she muttered. George nodded slightly. "I know. They have been dealt with. But what worries me now is how much time we have left before the seal breaks completely." Jen held up a hand as the door to the kitchen opened again. The waitress came out carrying their food and set it in front of them. "Anything else I can get for you and your granddaughter?" she asked, and Jen shook her head. "We're fine, thanks." The waitress nodded and stepped out the front door. She pulled a pack of cigarettes from her apron pocket and lit one. Jen nodded for George to continue. "Do you have any way of checking?" Jen shook her head. "Not really," she said with her mouth full. George raised an eyebrow, and she rolled her eyes before finishing chewing and swallowing her mouthful as he began to cut his omelet. "Like I said, not really. It's too dangerous to use stardust to check it after what the Lacubra did to my cousin Gwen." George raised an eyebrow. "Your cousin is the sorceress my knights have told me about?" Jen shrugged as she finished another bite. "It's a bit more complicated than that, but for now, yeah. It got into her head." George frowned. "I killed it." He nodded to her. He'd seen her kill the Lacubra before. The first time it had happened, she'd broken down, babbling about having a rule that she did not kill. But the Lacubra weren't truly alive in the first place. They were offshoots of the Dagon's power, spawned from death and destruction. Eventually, she'd been able to down them with the best of the knights, but it had taken some time to get to that point. She shook her head. "I remember how difficult it was to get a Lacubra out of someone's head. I'm betting that hasn't changed." George nodded. "That I don't know. Without the Dagon present in this world, she could be free of its power completely, but even the death of a Lacubra back then didn't always free the victim." Jen nodded, "which is why she has no idea I'm here. Or Kevin, for that matter, because he'd tell her in a heartbeat." Jen said, reaching into the bag sitting next to her on the seat. She pulled out 2 books and laid them on the table. George smiled at them. One was bound in green leather, the other in plain leather. Both were embossed with different symbols. "You found them? How?" Jen grinned. "Long story short, a friend of mine is a budding archaeologist and found half of Forever Night Castle in the Nevada desert. How did that happen?" George laughed into his omelet. "One of my knights decided it would be a good idea to seduce and abandon a sorceress." Jen burst out laughing as the waitress came back into the diner, having finished her cigarette. "That explains the trap." George snorted. They finished their food, talking about easy things that wouldn't draw the curiosity of their waitress. When they were finished, and the waitress had slipped off again to talk to the cook, Jen looked over George. "What will you do now?" George picked up the green book. "I will find Ascalon. My men are arming for the war ahead. There will be many battles if the Dagon truly escapes." He paused. "You could come with me. I have my base set, everything we need." Jen raised an eyebrow. "Base?" "I may have borrowed some military equipment." Jen snorted into her Coke. "You stole Area 51. George nodded. Jen burst out laughing. "Stole is a strong word. I have every intention of returning it." Jen laughed long and loud, her face turning red. When she finally caught her breath, he raised an eyebrow at her. "Will you come with me to find Ascalon?" Jen shook her head, swiping at her eyes. "I can't. Too many people know me. I need to be here, try and head off what I can here. There's no telling where the fortress might turn up." George nodded, picking up the books. "Stay safe, my friend." He laid down a $100 bill as he stood and walked out of the diner. Jen stood and hurried out to her bike. Slipping on her helmet, she gunned the engine and drove off down the street. She needed to get some sleep. Julie had asked her to meet downtown at lunch the next day. It had been too long since she'd hung out with her friend. It would be nice to have a normal day for once. Chapter 14. Tension. Jen wasn't expecting Kevin to show up at the spot Julie had asked to meet her. Julie was already there, and she grinned, then frowned. "Where's Gwen?" Kevin shrugged. "Class." Julie looked a bit put out, but nodded. Jen tucked her helmet into the saddlebag of her motorcycle. "Thought this was a girl's day, Jules. No offense, Kev." He shrugged. "I was a bit surprised when you called me too, Julie," Kevin said, clicking on the locks to his car. Julie smiled at both of them. "Well, I want both of you here. All 3, really, but Gwen's so busy lately." Jen nodded. "Yeah, graduating early takes work." Julie nodded. "I bet. But I wanted to show you guys something. I've been wanting to show you for a while. It's the philanthropic organization I've been working with. Come on." Kevin and Jen exchanged confused looks as Julie led them into an office building. She kept talking as they walked. They do a lot of good work with underprivileged schools and hospitals in third world countries. They call themselves the Flamekeeper Circle. Kevin snorted as Jen raised an eyebrow. Bit of a mouthful, Jen stated coolly. Kevin nodded, looking around the well-decorated lobby.
What do these guys do for money again? They look like they're not hurting for it.
Julie rolled her eyes at the ex-con leading them into an elevator. They accept donations. Kevin laughed as Julie hit the elevator button.
Argent would love this place.
Jen snorted as Julie glared at Kevin. It's a non-profit, Kevin. Jen nodded. How do you find out about it? Julie grinned. They approached me at a tennis match. My status can help them spread their message to a wider audience. Kevin raised an eyebrow.
Your status as 103rd in women's tennis, or your well-known association with Jen?
Julie scowled. 82nd, thank you very much. Jen elbowed Kevin. Not everything is about me, Kev. The elevator door opened, and a voice rang out to them.
Jennifer Tennyson.
Kevin's first impression of Conduit Edwards was that the man bathed in smarm. He turned the charm up to 11, determined to get Jen to join his little organization, but Kevin was closer to thinking the word cult. The man didn't talk about what good works the organization did across the world, or donations. Instead, he talked about fire being the root of knowledge, that humans were gifted the basics of technology by a benevolent alien. Apparently one in particular. Edwards called him the Dagon, and Jen's entire demeanor shifted, from skeptical to on guard for a fight. Kevin frowned, leaning on the marble of the secretary's desk, the stone in easy reach if he needed it. Jen excused herself quickly after that, sending a searching look at the carved stone door they had passed earlier. Julie and Kevin followed her, Kevin making sure they weren't followed. Edwards had looked very disappointed when Jen had brushed him off. Jen, wait up! Julie called out as Jen quick-stepped to her bike. Jen paused. That was really rude. He's just trying to help people. Jen whirled on them, and Kevin spotted a gleam in her eyes he recognized. He'd seen it a few times before, but only when they were facing off against world-ending threats like Vilgax. Julie, you need to get out of there. Stop going to these meetings, please. Julie stiffened. Why? Because only you get to save the world? She asked bitterly. Julie, trust me, they aren't in this for the good of all mankind. Jen, you barely let him talk after he mentioned his beliefs. I can't believe you would be so close-minded. Jen's fists clenched. Did it ever occur to you that I know a shit ton more about aliens than you do? Maybe, just maybe, for once in our lives, I know something you don't. Julie crossed her arms as Jen pulled out her helmet and mounted her bike. I'm going to the meeting tonight. You should come too. They're good people, Jen. Please, if you gave them the chance, you'd see that. Jen flipped down her visor and took off before Julie could say anything else. Julie turned to Kevin. Will you be there? She sounded a bit like she was desperate.
Nah, I haven't seen Jen riled like this since the last time we fought Vilgax. It might be she knows something we don't.
He conceded, this only because she was no longer in earshot. Julie frowned. You spent more time in space than she has, right? Kevin nodded. Then have you ever heard of the Dagon? He shook his head.
Nope. Might not even be real for all I know. What I do know is that nothing ever comes for free, Julie. Even from aliens. If the Dagon is real, and maybe gave humanity something, there was a cost.
He clicked off the locks on his car and left Julie alone on the sidewalk. He made his way to the hole, the section of the plumber base under Ed's mechanic shop. He pulled up the plumber files and frowned before typing in his search. There was almost nothing in any of the files. The only thing that came up was the tapestry they kept running across, the one of Jen in the past. He wasn't well versed in Galvan, but he ran them through the translation software and frowned.
The defeat of the Dagon? What aren't you telling us, Jen?
Shaking his head, he stood and left the hole to go check on Pierce. Azimuth frowned as Eunice approached him. She was holding a datapad and wearing a frown. I know you said not to disturb you, but this alert keeps popping up. He sighed and turned from the white band he was tinkering with.
What could possibly be so important that you could interrupt this project?
She held out the data pad and he frowned, eyes going wide. They were both silent for a moment. Eunice raised an eyebrow. What does it mean? Asmith set down his tools.
Nothing but trouble. I need to speak to Jennifer.
He tapped out coordinates on the teleporter he wore on his wrist and vanished before Eunice could say anything. Oh, sure, I'd love to see her. Maybe you could tell your assistant what's going on. She griped as she made her way out of the lab. Myax laughed lightly.
He is always like that, little one. The first thinker rarely shares his thoughts with his assistants.
Eunice frowned as the taller female ruffled her blonde hair.
If it was important enough to put a pause on completing the finalized Omnitrix, then it must be of world-shaking importance. He'll be back soon. Come, we need to do the daily checks of the codon stream.
Eunice nodded and followed the tall alien out of the only large building on Primus.